Today, I have a very special guest who is the author Melissa Gould, who's going to talk to us about her new #1 Amazon best-selling book, Widowish, about her experience with her late husband, Joel, who lived with multiple sclerosis and later passed away from West Nile encephalitis. It's beautifully written. It talks about her experiences living with someone with a disability and as a young widow. I have some links below if you want to check it out yourself, along with the link to her website. And it's no surprise that it's well written because Melissa is a very successful TV screenwriter and producer. She wrote for Walt Disney Television. Some of her credits include Bill Nye the Science Guy, Lizzie McGuire, Party of Five, Beverly Hills 90210. She was even nominated for an Emmy. Thank you, Melissa, for coming on to talk to me today.
Thanks so much, Brandon. It's so good to be here.
So you're very talented. You've done a lot in your career, and I know it's been a crazy year. You're finally getting to the finish line. How are you doing in 2021 so far? We survived 2020, right?
The funny thing about 2020 is, obviously it's been devastating for most of the world. But as a writer, my life was not that affected by it. I'm a homebody. I work from home. It's funny because I am certainly aware of all of the changes that had to be made because of coronavirus and all of that. But 2020 was not horrible for me. In many ways it was, but in a lot of ways it wasn't. And now that we're in 2021, I'm just so hopeful that the world is going to settle and start to heal and become more unified. And I'm looking forward to what lies ahead.
Well, I do have some insider knowledge, and I can't tell you everything, but let's just say the numbers are looking better, at least in Southern California. And another thing is, Melissa and I, we both live in Los Angeles, and one good thing that happened this year, or at least in 2020, is both the Lakers and Dodgers finally came through. They both won the championship. The Rams didn't succeed, but it's pretty amazing after 30 years of the Dodgers not winning.
It's funny, I don't really speak the sports, but my husband Joel was a huge Dodger fan, and I can't help but think of him whenever they're playing. Certainly when they won the World Series, that was huge. And I also love the fact that everybody who knew Joel knew about his love of the Dodgers. So I started hearing from people when they won the World Series, and it was just thrilling.
Yeah, well, I was happy about it for sure. And I know, the thing I like most about your book is really the love story and how, you and Joel started off as friends and fate seemed to bring you together and you actually met randomly at Dodger Stadium. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you and Joel came to be?
That's so sweet. So Joel and I actually met when I was still a teenager. It was my summer job and his job. We both worked at Atlantic Records in West Hollywood on the Sunset Strip. And we became fast friends. We were in different places in our lives. He was a few years older. But we kind of fell in like at first sight. And we both knew we kind of enjoyed each other's company. The timing was always sort of off. We were never a couple. The thoughts of being a couple never even occurred to us. I had other relationships. He had a serious relationship. A few years went by. This is pre-internet, pre-cell phones. So really, we kind of lost touch with each other, but we had so many friends in common that every now and then I would hear about him. I moved to New York and was living there for a while. The week I moved back to Los Angeles, and I moved back to become a screenwriter, but that week, a friend invited me to a Dodger game. And I had never been to a baseball game. I had maybe been to Dodger Stadium for a concert or something. And the minute we walked in, and that's when you handed somebody your ticket, I look up and I see this familiar face, and it was Joel. And he happened to be turned around because he was expecting somebody else to be walking through the doors. And our eyes met and we were like, oh my God. And he knew that I had been living in New York. He had no idea that I was moving back to LA because I had literally just arrived. And we reconnected there at Dodger Stadium. The timing was still off, but it was around a year later. I had moved to Seattle and was working on my first job, which was Bill Nye the Science Guy, as you mentioned. And I got a call from Joel. He was making some changes in his life and happened to be touring with this heavy metal band, which was not really his kind of music, but his job was he was on the road with the metal band Anthrax. They were rolling through Seattle. He asked if we could get together, and I was so excited, and I couldn't believe that I was going to see Joel in Seattle. And he met me after work one day and kind of declared his love for me and his feelings. And I just couldn't believe it, because when we met and over the years that we knew each other, I always in my head thought, I want to marry somebody just like Joel. I never thought it would be him, but he kind of set the bars. Like, he's so cool and he's so funny and he's so handsome. I just never thought it would be him. But so our paths kind of crossed in and out for a few years, and eventually the timing was right. And yeah, that's our love story. It's a good one.
It's kind of crazy to think that if you hadn't seen him at Dodger Stadium, your whole life would be completely different, right?
Yeah, and the funny thing about running into each other at the Dodger game is that we knew each other from the music industry. So had I seen him that same day or that night at a club, seeing a band, or at some industry, music industry function, that would have made much more sense. But seeing him at the Dodger game was so out of I couldn't compute that this was the Joel I knew, the cool music guy. But then I came to find out, of course, that he was a lifelong Dodger fan, had season tickets. I didn't know that stuff before, but I learned it. And same with the Lakers. And yeah, he was a very athletic guy. He was born and raised in LA, and he cared a lot about his hometown teams.
Yeah, I mean, even if you were going to be at the same stadium, the chance that you would actually see them is so low. I mean, for those who don't know, Dodger Stadium is a complete mess. There are like 10 different entrances. So, I mean, you could easily be there and not see someone or not recognize someone if you haven't seen them in 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, that was great. It wasn't quite 10 years. It was more like 4 or 5 years, but it was still crazy.
Yeah. So, how did your relationship start off? So you eventually got together, and then you had Sophie. And what was your life like early in marriage?
So yes, we have one daughter, Sophie. We had like a pretty great life together. I mean, Joel and I think because we were friends for so many years before we became a couple, our friendship was such a solid base for a good marriage, because we really liked each other. We both would always say we were in love and we were in like. And I think that is so important. And I certainly hope that for my daughter when she gets married one day. But Joel and I were friends. I mean, we really got each other. He continued to work in the music industry. I became a screenwriter. We had a pretty nice life. Sophie was a very happy kid, had a very happy childhood. And Joel and I were married in 1997. And in 2008, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And the way that came about is that, like I said, Joel was very into his teams and his basketball and his baseball, but he also was an avid sports enthusiast on his own. I mean, he was in a baseball league and a softball league. He played basketball several times a week. He played racquetball. He went to the gym every day. He was a pretty athletic guy. And he came home from a basketball game one night complaining that his legs weren't working. He said, I can see the action happening all around me. I see the ball moving down the court, and I tell my body, go, and I can't. And he was very concerned. He felt that something was really wrong. And he went to the same basketball game the following week, expecting a different outcome. There wasn't. It was the same. This inability to move and this disconnect between his body and his brain was really concerning. So he went to see a neurologist, and basically after they did a basic MRI and saw that Joel had a bulge in his back, in his spine, I think. And they prescribed physical therapy, which was protocol. But Joel, he went to physical therapy, but he kept saying that's not what it is. Anybody my age, and at this point he was 40, in his early 40s. He's like, anybody my age who gets an MRI, of course they're going to find something in your back. There's going to be like, we're old. And but he was otherwise healthy. I mean, he was really like the picture of health. And so it was frustrating. He finished the course of physical therapy. There was no improvement. I think he saw a different neurologist who ordered another MRI, this time with contrast, which I don't know why that wasn't done the first time, but it wasn't. So the second time, and this was a period of probably like 5 months, 6 months. The second MRI, because of the contrast, showed lesions on his spinal cord and brain. And that's when we knew definitively, and he was given the diagnosis that he had multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, and I think that's a very common experience. I've actually heard that exact history a few times from my patients, that someone's playing basketball or another sport. And it can be really frustrating because some people with MS have like exercise-induced symptoms or heat-induced symptoms. So, just walking around normally, there are no real symptoms. You go and see a neurologist and they examine you and your exam looks pretty normal, but then maybe during intense exercise, the symptoms come out. And there's like a really good TED talk about a competitive runner who she runs competitively and in college, but she has numbness in her legs when running. So that can definitely happen sometimes. Yeah. And, it looks like they just kind of scanned the wrong area. His lumbar spine, the spinal cord ends at T12, so there are no MS lesions there, and just didn't see it. Of course, it's easier after the fact to know what the right thing is to do. So, I know he got started on the medication Copaxone, which is glutamer acetate. There's also the brand name Glatopa. And how did that go for him?
So the wonderful thing about getting this diagnosis, if I want to reframe it, is that because we're in Los Angeles, and I'm sure this is, in different places around the country, but there really are a number of MS specialists in the area. And we felt so fortunate to find one and have Joel be under his care. And that gave us a lot of relief and comfort to know that his medical team was like number one. And so when they recommended the Copaxone, and there were a lot of medications available. There are even more now. But it worked for Joel. It was an injection, I want to say 3 nights a week. It became part of his routine. And he was able to give himself a shot. It was like shot, ice, Advil, or Tylenol, I think. And he did that 3 times a week. And it really worked in staving off the symptoms. He wasn't really able to continue with basketball to the level that he had been playing. He started riding his bike more. He started taking yoga, which was really life-changing for him because I think the mind-body connection of yoga was very appealing. And I would be, he got me into yoga, and Joel would be able to do moves and poses and things that I still struggle with, but he, his physical health was important to him. And so he really made the most out of a difficult situation. And he was fairly optimistic as a person. And so he wasn't going to let the MS bring him down. And the Copaxone really helped to manage his symptoms. And, our lives, we made some modifications, but he was doing great for a number of years.
Yeah, and I know you said he did have a side effect sometimes, like what we'll sometimes call a systemic reaction, where you inject the Copaxone and sometimes you may get bizarre symptoms throughout the body. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I want to say that we were told, or it was on the packaging or something, that you may have like a heart attack feeling. Joel had that night 1 of taking the medication. So of course that made us a little bit nervous. He informed his doctors that said, if it happens, it's unusual. That may be the only time it happens. Just keep an eye on it. And sure enough, it didn't happen again for at least several months, if not even a year. But he was on the Copaxone for 4 years. And we were told at the onset that the medication has a lifespan of sorts, that it wouldn't be as effective the longer he was on it, and to just kind of track how he was feeling. So sure enough, I want to say in year 4, he was getting that heart attack-like feeling with a lot more frequency. But he didn't even want to tell his doctors, because otherwise he was feeling pretty good on the Copaxone. But I think I encouraged him to try something new, because it just made me nervous that it was happening. I don't want to say all the time, but a lot. And I just thought it was time for us to switch. And also by that point, he really wasn't feeling well. So now I'm going into the year 2013. And that year was just a seminal year in our lives, because first of all, Sophie was turning 13 and having her bat mitzvah, and Joel was turning 50. And so there were these big events happening in our lives that year. And it was the same year that Joel passed away at the end of the year. Of course, we didn't see that coming, but starting in January of that year, that's when he was really having issues with the Copaxone. And I think we were switching medication, and he had at least 1 or 2 more MRIs that indicated a pretty severe lesion on his brain. And his doctors were convinced that once he got started on a new course of treatment, that the lesion would subside, wouldn't be as activated, and that he would kind of resume, not ever back to 100%, but back to where he was able to, like I said, he's doing yoga, riding his bike, being as active as he had been in the years prior, living with MS.
Yeah, and he did pretty well. But just to back up a little bit, to get diagnosed with a serious neurological disease when you're healthy and active and working full time and successful and have kids is a very traumatic thing to deal with. And I know you guys had a little bit of experience and knowledge of MS. What was your perception of it at the time, like when he first got diagnosed? What did you think of multiple sclerosis as?
Well, I think it's probably typical that when you're given a diagnosis like that, your mind goes to the worst case scenario. And at that time, we did have some friends and family members who had MS, but we learned it presents differently in everybody. We knew it affected your mobility, but in terms of like our perception, for better or worse, we knew that Terry Garr had MS and that she was in bad shape. Richard Pryor had MS. He was in pretty bad shape. Annette Funicello. I don't even remember if Annette Funicello or Richard Pryor were alive at the time, but we knew that they had this debilitating disease called MS, and that was terrifying to us. But at the same time, we saw that they lived long lives. We felt that the MS was more a quality of life disease, is how we refer to it, that it wasn't necessarily something that would kill Joel or, shorten his lifespan, but we knew the quality of his life would be affected. And by that, I mean, he wasn't able to play basketball anymore. That gave him so much joy. Because he was in the music industry, and I write about this in the book, he was going to concerts several times a week. It was part of what he did. It was his job, and he loved it. But he had to stop going, even to Coachella. He would go to Coachella every year. And when he would go, because it was his industry, he had like the VIP treatment, but it was still difficult because if he couldn't sit down for a period of time, he couldn't stand and watch these bands for hours and hours, like how most people do when you go to a weekend event like Coachella and you're on your feet all the time and you're moving and you're capable of these things. Joel wasn't. And that really affected him mentally and emotionally. He felt that the MS was really robbing him of the things that made him him. So that was an upsetting part of the diagnosis that didn't come until several years into it.
Yeah, and I think that's very common that if I had seen him, I may have not known that he has MS. He looks superficially good, but he has
Right.
all these subtle and visible symptoms like poor stamina, fatigue, and other things. And I think that, while he was alive, he was even thinking to himself, I don't know how much longer I could work. I may have to go on disability at some point, right?
He definitely thought that, again, that year of 2013, whether it was because of this particularly bad lesion or because the medication just wasn't kicking in when we switched from the Copaxone to a new one, he was really feeling quite debilitated. His legs were oftentimes very stiff. Walking became extremely difficult for him. He worried that, he would be in a wheelchair, and he worried about being self-sufficient. And those things were really scary. I mean, he was 49 years old, and dealing with a future that we would have managed. We would have figured it out. We would have, if he was in a wheelchair, any of those things, we would have coped. And yes, life would be different, but we would figure it out. But those were scary notions for somebody, like I said, who was 49. Our daughter was 12 going on 13, trying to anticipate what life would be like. These were scary prospects.
Yeah, and I know 2013 is the year that Joel got sick. But, I want to hear a little bit about your life in the meantime. I know it's a big deal to be a successful screenwriter and have these kinds of credits. I used to go to writing groups at meetup.com, and half the people there are aspiring screenwriters because it's Los Angeles, but,
Right.
None of them are doing it professionally, and none of them have anything that was actually sold or made into anything. How did you break into that industry?
It's so funny. I was just so determined. I was so ambitious and so driven. And if somebody knew somebody whose roommate's cousin's girlfriend worked in TV, I would call them. I mean, again, this is the 1990s, so it's like pre-internet, pre-cell phone. There was no such thing as an email or texting. Like, you'd actually have to pick up the phone. I just kept writing. I had so many sample scripts. I had half-hour comedies. I had 1-hour dramas. I was determined that I was going to have a screenwriting credit by the time I turned 25. And which is so crazy because I think I know 25-year-olds now and they seem like children to me. So I don't know how I was able to do it, but I just was like laser focused. And I was lucky. I did know people who knew people, and that always helps to have somebody open the door for you. But I think Oprah says, luck is where opportunity and preparation meet. And I was prepared and I was given the opportunity. And in that sense, I was lucky. And Bill Nye the Science Guy was my first job. That was thrilling. This was like nobody knew who Bill Nye was. If you didn't live in Seattle, nobody had ever heard of Bill Nye. It's funny how now, 20-something years later, more, he's like this huge celebrity. He always was that locally in Seattle. But when I would tell people, I worked on this show called Bill Nye the Science Guy, they're like, okay, never heard of it. But then I went on and had, worked on other shows that people definitely heard of. I wrote some TV movies. I wrote a lot of things that never saw the light of the screen. But yeah, I had a very nice run as a screenwriter. And, the crazy thing is, I think that when I was young, I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I always assumed I would be an author. But I got sidetracked by screenwriting, which, is fantastic. And, but it's just the irony that I now have my first book out, and it's because I'm a young widow and my husband is no longer here. Like, it's just surreal because I know nobody would be as excited or as thrilled for me as Joel.
Yeah, well, it seems like you guys had a certain connection, and you were both artists and in this entertainment industry, because he worked in music production and that kind of thing. So maybe you had some sort of connection there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said this earlier, like he really got me and I really got him. And I think that was such a gift. He understood like the highs and the lows of being being in Hollywood and working in the industry. There were a lot of highs and a lot of lows, and he was there for all of it, and was always like my biggest fan and cheerleader. And
Yeah, I know as a screenwriter, you're a behind the scenes person. You don't necessarily get a lot of credit, but is there any kind of famous Hollywood scene that you're responsible for that you wrote?
No, I mean, I will say that the last TV show that I was on was Lizzie McGuire. And the thing about that show is that it really helped put Disney Channel on the map. It was pre-Hannah Montana, just before that. So, I mean, I was in the room when we all came up with the word tween. So that was, I mean, the funny thing about Lizzie McGuire and all the Disney Channel things that I've written, it's not like I'm writing for a younger audience. I'm just writing the way I am in the world and the way I talk to people. So it's funny because people always assume, oh, if you write for kids, you must be writing like down in a way. And I never felt like that. So I was always proud of that I just wrote like we were on the same level. And I think the show was a pretty big success. So that was great.
Absolutely. I can't say that I've watched it, but it's obviously very well known. Maybe I'm not the target demographic there. But so anyways, in 2013, you experienced what, many people think is the most traumatic thing that you can experience in life, which is the loss of a spouse. So tell us a little bit about how Joel became ill.
So what happened was, again, he had this particularly bad lesion. His health seemed to be rapidly declining. He had a lot of difficulty moving, and his legs were very problematic and walking. And as protocol, and you would be able to speak to this more, but he had taken in the past like an oral steroid during times where he wasn't feeling great. And frequently that kind of kicked things back into gear where like he'd be feeling sort of low, feeling like moving was a struggle, and he would be prescribed a steroid. And for like 3 or 4 days, he'd be like high as a kite on a steroid. But at the end of that, like he would sort of even out and be okay. In 2013, he had taken a dose of the oral steroids and they really didn't help at all. And so his doctors prescribed IV steroids. Again, this was all in an effort to sort of bridge ending the one medication and starting another. And the one that he was starting just was not kicking in. So I think the belief was that the steroids will help kind of fuse and the new medication will kick in and he'll be okay. So a nurse came to the house for 4 or 5 days, gave Joel an IV drip of steroids, during which time we were told, very much like COVID right now, no visitors. Joel wasn't allowed to leave the house. We had to wipe everything down. We weren't wearing masks, but it was like Joel, Sophie, me, and the nurse were the only people in our house that week. And the reason behind that was because the steroids were going to potentially lower his already fragile immune system. So we were very careful that week. I mean, the most Joel did would putter around outside in the backyard, which was his happy place. And about a month later, by the way, the steroids didn't help. So these steroids, which were exponentially stronger and that he had been on for 4 or 5 days, really led to zero improvement. About a month after that, Joel started having these flu-like symptoms. He had an extremely high fever, but he would take Tylenol and the fever would go away. He was completely lucid, but he would get up and do something like empty the dishwasher, and then he would sleep for 4 hours. Like something was off. And again, we thought this could be the new medication, but this doesn't seem like MS. It was very confusing. And so Joel and I made the decision together to take him to the hospital. So we were fluent in MS, but we didn't know from hospitals. So we go to the hospital thinking maybe this is the flu. They admit him. He was communicative. He was able to talk to the doctors. He was fine other than his high fever. I couldn't wait to get home and disinfect the house. I didn't want to catch the flu. I didn't want Sophie to get it, or whatever it was that Joel was experiencing. And the next day when I came to the hospital, Joel was completely out of it in a way I had never seen before. And I thought I was going to, and the World Series or whatever happens pre-World Series, those games were on TV. And I thought I was going to show up at the hospital, turn on the Dodger game, and we're going to hunker down and Joel will be back at work like in a couple of days. It was clear the minute I walked in that was not the case. And an infectious disease doctor came to see him and immediately started to ask me if Joel had been bitten by anything like a mosquito or a spider, and was really like searching Joel, his entire body, looking for a bite or a welt or something that might indicate something. But there was nothing. And he was asking me if I had been exposed to certain things, and had I been around anybody who had the measles, or been anybody, and I didn't understand the line of questioning. And within another day or two, Joel was in a coma. And the doctors at this particular hospital, which is a big, major hospital in our city, it's people go there for cancer treatments, to give birth, that, were suggesting that I move Joel to a different hospital where he could be under the watchful eye of his MS team. Because at that point, there was concern that maybe this was a reaction to the new medication. But there was so much confusion in the hospital. The doctors really had no idea what this was. They had no idea why Joel was in a coma, how he got so sick so quickly. But they were circling the idea that this was perhaps a virus of some kind. That aside, they also weren't sure if this was a reaction to the MS meds. So, and I was in constant communication with Joel's MS doctors, and they also thought, bring him to us at our hospital, and we'll keep a closer eye on him. So sure enough, I moved him to that hospital. I didn't even know he was in a coma. I had to ask the admitting doctor of the new hospital, because they kept saying Joel's not communicative. And I thought, well, what does that mean? And so I just said, is my husband in a coma? And she was like, oh yeah, she's a coma, sort of an umbrella term, but yeah, he's in a coma. That casual. And I was like, oh, I had no idea. And Joel's dad was with me, and we were like, we didn't know he was in a coma. I mean, the whole thing was so surreal. And Joel just really went from bad to worse. Every day I would, meet with the doctors. There were neurologists and pulmonologists and physical therapists, and every kind of doctor was, coming in and out of his hospital room. He was hooked up to machines. He was in a coma. Nobody knew why. And every test for all of these viruses came back negative. But every brain angiogram and all of these things kept coming back with his brain function was slowing down. One day I was told he was paralyzed from the waist down. The next day I was told he was paralyzed from the neck down. Then I was told he had zero brain function. I mean, it just went from bad to worse. But the entire time I kept thinking, like so irrationally, okay, well, once they know what this is, they'll make him better. Like, he won't be paralyzed anymore. He'll get his brain function back. They'll give him whatever dose of whatever they need to give him, and he'll improve. But that's not what happened. And eventually they had tested for West Nile virus at the first hospital, and the cultures came back negative. They kept repeating tests for a variety of these viruses. They all kept coming back negative. But the second or even third test for West Nile virus came back positive. And that's when we knew that it was the end, because I realized, as now the world sadly, unfortunately, knows with COVID, that these viruses really just have to run their course. There's no treatment. There's no antibiotic. There's no medication. They run their course, wreak havoc, and in Joel's case, caused him to die. And it was completely unexpected. Completely, I know I've said surreal a few times, but it's still surreal. It's surreal that we're sitting here talking about it. It's surreal that I have a book out about being a widow. It's surreal that it's my husband we're talking about. It's beyond.
Yeah, I mean, even though this is many years ago, I can hear in your voice it's very painful to describe it. I can't imagine what it's like to go through that. For people who don't know, West Nile virus is borne by mosquitoes, and that's kind of why you're advised not to leave standing water around in your backyard, like cover the trash cans, make sure your pool is well maintained. And Melissa had a neighbor that maybe had a poorly maintained pool, which is possibly where the infection came from. It's impossible to know that. And the thing about West Nile is it's very common. A lot of people have no symptoms whatsoever. And a lot of people just have mild symptoms like rash and muscle aches and fever and then recover. But then a small percentage of people have what they call neuroinvasive West Nile, and it can cause meningitis or encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. And it can also invade the motor neurons and cause weakness. And presumably Joel had both of those things. And some people, they kind of recover and they may have some weakness as if they had something similar to polio. And some people, it can be fatal. And so, we don't know if Joel was unlucky or maybe the steroids or the multiple sclerosis disease modifying therapy could increase susceptibility. Obviously, we're leaving the name of the disease-modifying therapy out, but I'll just say that it's not particularly associated with West Nile encephalitis, which in general is quite rare, and I don't believe I've ever seen anyone with multiple sclerosis get it. But anyway, after that devastating experience, what was your life like as a young widow? How did you adapt to that?
It was, again, I'll say the word surreal. It was devastating. It was completely unexpected. I'm so grateful that I was there to say goodbye to Joel, that I had that opportunity. There are so many people with COVID who don't. And I'm only making the comparison virus to virus. They are completely different diseases, or viruses, I should say. But Sophie became my focus. She was 13. She is an only child. I say I became an only parent. And it took me a while. I mean, thankfully, I had her to focus on, and I felt like that really helped me. I don't know if she would agree with this, but I just became like laser focused on my kid and felt such a responsibility to make sure that she would get out of this okay. But it was very strange to be the town widow. And the way I came up with the title Widowish is that, I didn't look like a widow. I was young. I was in my 40s. I didn't act like a widow, mostly because I found love again shortly after Joel died. But I didn't look like a widow. I didn't act like a widow, but I felt like a widow. I still feel like a widow. But that's really my definition of widowish, is I could just tell I had to sort of reconcile this tremendous loss of losing my person and being out in the world and people not necessarily knowing that when they looked at me. I was just like another mom in LA, going to yoga, picking up my kid from school, going to Trader Joe's. Nobody knew my story when they looked at me, and I felt it was important. I wanted people to know I was like half a person. And so it took some time to sort of reconcile this idea that I was an only parent, I was a widow, and my husband was no longer here to share my life with. But because I was a writer and always made my living as a writer, a friend had encouraged me to start writing about what I was experiencing. And I didn't want to. I thought, I'm a screenwriter. I write make-believe. I don't write about myself. I couldn't believe that there would be an interest in that. And I didn't even know how to write anything personal. I was so turned off by the idea. But of course, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So once she kind of planted this seed that you should write something personal, that's all I kept thinking about. And I was in a writing group at the time, working on a novel. And sure enough, the following week, I decided I'm just going to write something personal about being a young widow. I felt like I had so much to say about being a widow in the world and being an only parent and just having this life that I was having. And once I started writing about it, I couldn't stop. And week after week, I was writing like essay after essay after essay. And then they started getting published. First thing I think that happened is I got a column in the Huffington Post, which was amazing. And then I started submitting my essays to different publications, and I had them published in the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. And I realized I did have something to say. And my story was sort of different because it was so unexpected and so strange to have a husband die of West Nile virus. And the result of all of that experience and really reconciling this new world that I was inhabiting is my book, Widowish. So I'm so happy to share it with the world. It is such a gift because it really is what keeps Joel alive. And to me, that's everything. So more people who read the book get to know Joel. They hear about us and our family and our whole story. And really, I never expected that. And also that I hear from so many people who have also lost a spouse or have gone through a really bad divorce or a change in their life. I mean, it's really touching people in a way that I wasn't expecting. And it's amazing. Like it feels incredible that my story would resonate for anybody else is just such a gift.
Yeah, it certainly resonated with me. And even though I'm not going through that, it's so beautifully written. And I think that it gives a lot of words of wisdom to many people facing many different situations in life. One thing that I thought was interesting is that you're Jewish, but you had sort of a rare, unexpected source of inspiration and comfort, who was the evangelical pastor Joel Osteen. Tell me about that a little bit. Why would a Jewish person listen to Joel Osteen?
I have no idea, Brandon. I mean, that's what's so crazy too, just about grief is there's no rhyme or reason to it. It makes no sense. I was told early on about certain books I should read or certain people I should talk to, other young widows, and I really wasn't interested. I felt very private about my grieving, and I didn't want to share it. I think that's also why it took me a while to start writing about it. But I was waiting for my daughter one day, and I was in the car listening to my satellite radio, and I heard a commercial that said something like, "Stay tuned, and Joel will be right back with another heart-filled message," something like that. So just hearing the name Joel had me like frozen. And I was always looking for signs from him. And where is he? And where are you, hon? And are you okay? And so when I heard that, I thought, oh my God, this is it. He's coming to talk to me. I couldn't believe it. It ended up being Joel Osteen. And I was somehow on his radio, his Sirius XM station. But I didn't change the channel because I actually could relate to what he was saying. And I liked the way he sounded. And I liked that his name was Joel. And this was the craziest. He had the same phone number as my Joel. So his Joel Osteen's number is like, 1-800 something something Joel. And my husband was, area code something 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 Joel. So I just like Joel, the phone number. He was funny. Like I liked him. And I didn't mind that he was using Christianity as the medium for his message. I appreciated the message. And that's one thing I love about Judaism too, is we're encouraged to question and to explore. And so I didn't feel like I was betraying my Judaism at all by embracing this new sort of evangelical, I wasn't, I don't know, I didn't convert or anything. I just appreciated the message that Joel Osteen was offering. And I still do.
And I know you did some other things, like in the Jewish tradition, there's sitting Shiva, kind of the practice of mourning, after you lose a spouse. What did you do in terms of that?
So we had Shiva at my house for a few days, and it was a really, I so see the value in it again, because people aren't able to do that now, to gather and mourn the loss of somebody collectively. But I see the value in that, because in a way it's just a great distraction of having people in your house who loved Joel, who wanted to talk about him. But it was also so sad, like I knew how difficult things had become for Joel that last year of his life, really. But friends of ours were shocked. I mean, it was shocking regardless, but because I was privy to all of his struggles, I think so many people walked in like they couldn't wrap their heads around it. And, Joel and I were a very vibrant and fun couple, and we entertained a lot, and we had a lot of friends. So it was so nice to have that comfort of people who loved him come into our house. But it was also just so bizarre because Joel wasn't there. And I kept waiting, every time I turned, I kept expecting to see him, and he was gone. So it was a strange time, but I'm so grateful that I was able to have Shiva, and I'm grateful to my friend who suggested it, because we didn't, in our age, and even with my parents, the odd thing is our daughter, who was 13 when her father died, all of her grandparents are still alive, which is also such a gift. But it didn't really prepare her for death. She had no experience with it. And then her father died at such a tender age. So it's sad. It's just sad. So Shiva was sad, but I'm so glad that we were able to do that.
Yeah, and it's, in the book, I think that you did very well as you could. I know it's very difficult for both Sophie and you. And later on, you developed a romantic relationship with Marcos. And I think a lot of people in your life weren't ready to see that. They were kind of expecting you to mourn forever and be sad forever. So what was that like? And how did you meet Marcos in the first place?
Okay, so Marcos was Sophie's guitar teacher. And I knew him very peripherally because guitar lessons fell under Joel's jurisdiction. So it was something that Joel would take Sophie to her lessons, and Joel knew Marcos. And there was a time or two where, of course, Joel couldn't make it, so I took Sophie. But the first time I saw him, I was stunned because he's very attractive, and nobody had told me. I thought like the mom hotline, like somebody would have given me a call. And when I mentioned it to a friend of mine, like, nobody told me the guitar teacher is so hot. She said, "Oh, get in line. We all have a crush on Mark. No big deal." And it wasn't a big deal. It was just kind of like, okay, the guitar teacher's attractive. But shortly after Joel died, it was actually like a few months, maybe like 5 or 6 months, I started cleaning out the house. And where I took so much comfort in his things still being near me, it started to become upsetting, because it was the reality that he was gone. He wasn't coming back. Again, grief is strange. It just plays tricks on you. You think, oh, Joel's shoes are still by the front door. He must be coming home soon. So 5, 6 months into it, I was like, I have to start getting rid of his things. And some of what I found in the garage was music equipment that I completely forgot we even had, that belonged to Joel. And I ran into Marcos one night, and at the time, everybody was still asking, do you need anything? Can I do anything? How can I help? And sure enough, I hadn't seen Marcos. He obviously had heard about Joel, and he, like everybody, said, if I can do anything, if you need help with anything, just let me know. And I was like, oh my God, I have all of that music stuff. Like, I don't know what to do with any of it. And so he said he would come over and help. And he did. So over the course of a few weeks, he would come over, he'd look at the music stuff. He helped me get rid of all of it. It was like such a relief. And I liked him. And it was a strange thing, because my heart was so broken because of Joel. And I kind of had like this tingling feeling of like, I kind of like this guy. And around the same time, a friend of mine, and this is in the book, had given me the advice to keep everything easy. Every choice, every decision, everything I did, choose easy. Because I tend to overthink, again, Jewish, I overthink everything. I second guess. And so when this kind of thing started happening with Marcos, I'm not going to overthink. I'm just going to let it happen. And one thing led to another. And we started dating, and things then got more serious. And it was really when we started going out publicly that this notion of widowish really struck me, because I didn't want people to think that because I was at a party with Marcos, first of all, what's a widow doing out of the house at a party with a man on a date? Oh my God. I didn't want that to take away from the fact that I was still grieving. I was still in mourning. I didn't want the world to think oh, Melissa must be over Joel because she's here, she's out, she's having fun. And that could not be further from the truth. And that really helped inform this idea, like I said earlier, I wasn't acting like a widow, but I felt like one. That goes back to the whole widowish identity and I still, and Marcos, P.S., we're still together. It's been 6 years. It took we're a strange pairing. Somehow it works. But I like the fact that he knew Joel. And I like the fact that, and this was one of the things I think that I was attracted to when we first got together, is he never treated me like the widow. He would look at me, he would talk to me, he would mention Joel easily. There was, a lot of people get very self-conscious. They don't know what to say, or they'll say nothing, or they'll say something that's kind of like, what? But Marcos he's a very cool guy. What you see is what you get. There's no pretense about him. And I just appreciated that so much, that he saw me as a person who had lost my husband, but it wasn't a defining characteristic of mine that, oh, she's the widow. It just was cool. And I appreciated that so much.
He's a very talented musician. I listened to some of his songs on YouTube. And you and Marcos meeting, it was sort of prophesized by a psychic, right? Which I thought was interesting.
Wow, you really read the book. Yes, so I had seen a psychic a few months after Joel had died. I made the appointment immediately, because in LA, good psychics are dinner reservations. You have to make them months in advance. But yeah, she had said something to me. I mean, it was such a great reading if you do that kind of thing, because she just validated the fact that Joel was still with me, that he was always going to be with me, always going to be with Sophie. But towards the end of the reading, she started laughing and said, I just can't believe this. There's another man who loves you. And I was so deep in my grief that I thought I wasn't hearing her correctly. I thought, okay, psychics they're all nuts. You take what you take from it, and this is all nuts. And she said, another man who loves you, and he has a son, and you already know him. And I'm I mean, that could be anybody. I know so many people who have sons, but I didn't really, that part of the reading didn't really stick with me until I was telling a friend of mine about the reading, and she went nuts. What do you mean? Who's the guy with the son? And we already know him, and maybe it's this person, and maybe it's that person. And it was the furthest thing from my mind. So even when Marcus and I started dating, and he does have a son, I never put the pieces together until much later. I said, oh my God, this is who the psychic was. She was right. Maybe she's not so crazy. She got this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So, by the way, when you mentioned how good looking Marcos is, it reminded me of another funny part of the book that made me laugh out loud. Now, we're not going to mention names or anything, but, multiple sclerosis is a small field. And so we know everyone. So, at one point, Melissa describes one of the neurologists she met as being so handsome that he literally looks like a prince out of a Disney movie. So I won't say who it is, definitely not me. But if anyone has any guesses, please post in the comments below. And
But
I'll
would
be
you disagree with that assessment?
no, he is a very good looking guy. He's a very good looking guy. So if anyone can guess, I will be very impressed, and I'll buy you a copy of Widowish.
Well, that's so funny. And I think what happened is Joel came home from an appointment one day, and there were always fellows and I don't know the correct term, doctors in training at all of his MS appointments. It was, a teaching hospital. And we would always talk about like, wow, they were so young, or, oh, that one was so smart, or I really liked this one. And I would usually go with Joel to his appointments. And there was one time I didn't go with him, and I was like, so who were the fellows when he came home? I'm like, who was there today? And he was like, hun, there was a guy. He's like, he looks like Prince Charming. He's like, you won't believe it when you see him next time. And I was like, really? So sure enough, I go with him to the next appointment. I mean, he just walked by the hallway. I'm like, is that? He's like, that's him. I'm like, oh my God. And then the other funny thing about that is that we would do the MS walks every year at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. And we would frequently run into Joel's doctors. And one of my friends came up, saw us talking, and came up to me and said, is that one of Joel's doctors? Same description. He looks like Prince Charming. And I was like, that's what we call him, behind his back. So yes, it is a small world.
But anyways, I had to throw that in there. So, to kind of sum it up a little bit, you've been through a lot. Is there any other advice you would give to someone? I think take the easy option is great advice. Is there any other advice you would give to someone who's dealing with the loss of a spouse or a relative or any kind of major trauma in life?
I really feel that grief is very personal, even though it's this universal experience. Everybody will go through it at some point in their life, but there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And I can use Joel Osteen as an example of that too. Like, I found comfort in his sermons. I couldn't tell you why. Grief makes no sense. But I wasn't beating myself up over it. I wasn't thinking like, I shouldn't be listening to this. This is but that's what worked for me. So I think, like with most things in life, we all have to find our own path. And what grief may look like for one person may look completely different for another. So I just think the best way to experience grief is really just to go through it. You can't hide from it. You can't run. As much as I wanted to, I tried it. And I say this in the book, just like with the MS traveled with us. It didn't, if we went on a vacation as a family, the MS came with us. Same thing with grief. You cannot escape it. And so for me, what worked is really just dealing with it head on. And like I said, I'm still grieving. I still miss my husband. I still feel like a widow. And I wish everybody continued healing who is dealing with something as devastating as the loss of a loved one.
A lot of people are dealing with it right now. I'm doing a lot of COVID-related work, both inpatient and outpatient, and I think a lot of people will get a lot out of this book. And it's a beautifully read. It's very well written, very entertaining. I love the love stories as well. And so by the time anyone is watching this, it will be published. It's published February 1st, 2021. And again, I'll put in some links in the description. And I would highly recommend it. And, I'd be interested to know, Melissa, are you now going to be a nonfiction writer or a novelist? Where do you want to take your career?
I will continue to write. I'm not sure what's coming next. I'm trying to figure that out now.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to do the interview. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much. This was great.